Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take these towering figures who have fundamentally shaped our global culture, grab hold of their complex histories, and really just distill the most profound nuggets of insight for you. Today, we are immersing ourselves in the vivid, sprawling, and frankly, often ghost-filled world of Gabriel García Márquez,
Gabo.
known affectionately across Latin America as Gabo or Gabito. Yeah. This man isn't just an author. He is widely considered the most significant Spanish-language writer of the 20th century.
And that designation is, it's hard-earned when we really look at the sources, his life, his work, his politics. We're charting this stunning transformation of a humble Colombian journalist into the undisputed global master of magic realism.
Right. And our specific mission in this deep dive is to understand the alchemy of his unique style. We want to know exactly how he blended political reality with, impossible fantasy. We'll be exploring how his deeply rooted childhood in Colombia's Caribbean coast, his relentless career in investigative journalism, and these enduring, profound themes of solitude and conflict all converge to shape monumental works like 100 Years of Solitude.
And the global impact is it's impossible to overstate. In 1982, he was deservedly awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his novels and short stories, in which the fantastic and the realistic are combined in a richly composed world of imagination, reflecting a continent's life and conflicts.
That was a huge moment for Latin America.
A huge moment. It made him the fourth writer from the region to get that honor, following poets and novelists like Gabriela Mistral, Pablo Neruda, and Miguel Ángel Asturias.
But if you want a true indicator of his literary weight, look no further than his current standing in the world of letters. García Márquez is currently the most translated Spanish-language author in the world.
Which is just incredible.
He recently surpassed Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote.
Think about that for a second.
Yeah, centuries of literary history, completely shifted by one man from a tiny town called Aracataca.
It's a stunning feat. And the success of his definitive work, it just confirms this reach. 100 Years of Solitude has sold over 50 million copies worldwide.
50 million?
It wasn't just a bestseller, it was a literary explosion that permanently redefined what a novel from the global south could achieve on the international stage. It made Latin American history a world subject.
Okay, let's unpack this journey. Let's start right at the beginning, the twin foundations that really created the magic we associate with Gabo.
Absolutely.
Gabriel García Márquez was born on March 6, 1927. In the town of Aracataca, right near the sweltering Caribbean coast of Colombia. But his formative years were marked by a feeling of being left behind.
Right, his parents moved away.
Exactly. His parents, Gabriel Eligio Garcia, who's a telegraph operator and pharmacist, and Luisa Santiago Márquez Iguarán, moved to Barranquilla soon after he was born. So young Gabriel was primarily raised by his maternal grandparents, Doña Tranquilina Iguarán Cotes and Colonel Nicolás Ricardo Márquez Mejía.
And this separation, this feeling of displacement, it's absolutely critical. Aracataca, surrounded by banana plantations and the humid, fifth-laden jungle, would later become the direct inspiration for the fictional village of Macondo.
Of course.
But the real magic, the real tension that defined his writing, it came from the incredibly stark, sort of contradictory influence of the two figures who raised him.
Okay, let's dedicate some serious time to the grandfather, Colonel Nicolás Ricardo Márquez Mejía. Gabo called him Papa Lelo. He was a liberal veteran of a devastating Thousand Days War, a civil conflict that just ravaged Colombia between 1899 and 1902. A deeply respected figure, a man of history.
And GGM openly said that the colonel was his umbilical cord with history and reality. In a place where reality was often, romanticized, or, on the other hand, brutally censored, the colonel was a fierce realist.
He was known for refusing to stay silent, wasn't he?
He was,
Yeah.
especially about the atrocities that happened nearby, specifically the 1928 banana massacres. That event became a central, traumatic memory for the whole region, and absolutely for Gabo.
And we see that stark reality reflected in the kinds of stories he told his grandson. Instead of, traditional fairy tales, the colonel would share these horrifying accounts of the last civil war that free thinkers and anti-clerics waged against the conservative government.
That's a heavy dose of history for a child.
A very heavy dose. But it gave Gabo this immediate, visceral connection to his nation's political and, often violent past.
And that connection wasn't just abstract history, it was moral teaching. The colonel taught him about the profound moral weight of human conflict. There's that famous quote where the colonel, describing the aftermath of war, told his young grandson, "You can't imagine how much a dead man weighs."
I know.
GGM would integrate that specific, heavy moral lesson directly into his novels, particularly the ones focused on war and political violence. It shows the lasting psychological toll of conflict.
But the colonel also introduced him to the wonder that can be found in the mundane, right? There's the famous story of the colonel taking him to the local United Fruit Company store.
And showing him ice.
Yes, showing him ice. For the young Gabo, in that relentless tropical heat, the sensation of frozen water was just a miracle.
And that small specific anecdote is the perfect seed for magic realism. The colonel, the man of history, presents this very factual object ice, but in that setting it's received as pure, impossible magic.
That's a great point.
It taught Gabo that the most ordinary facts, when you view them from a certain angle or in a certain environment, they possess this inherent wonder. This political base and moral realism, rooted in the colonel, became Gabo's foundation for his opposition to the status quo.
So if the colonel represented history and reality,
Then his grandmother, Doña Tranquilina Iguaran Coates, was the architect of his fantastic imagination.
absolutely.
She was the source of the magical, superstitious, and supernatural view of reality. You have to think about what their house must have been like. It was saturated with stories of ghosts, premonitions, omens, portents.
And crucially, she presented all of this as something perfectly natural.
Exactly. There was no need for explanation or fear. It was just part of the furniture of existence.
And this is where we really start to see the analysis of his literary style begin. Her narrative delivery was the single most defining characteristic Gabo later adopted for his work. She told these fantastic, utterly improbable stories, a ghost appearing, a bad omen being fulfilled, as if they were irrefutable truth.
With a profound, almost completely sincere, deadpan expression.
That deadpan style is everything.
It is. It's the art of speaking the impossible with the boring sincerity of a bureaucrat reading a weather report. She didn't pause for emphasis or explain the supernatural. That emotionless, matter-of-fact delivery of impossible events is the signature narrative voice that structures 100 years of Solitude.
So it's the synthesis.
Yeah.
The colonel's brutal political realism and the grandmother's effortless acceptance of the impossible.
That's the true, deep genesis of magic realism. You need both to create his universe.
Before we move on from his early life, we have to touch on the courtship of his parents. It was fascinating, a bit scandalous, and it wasn't just a family story. It became a template for another masterpiece.
Right. His father, Gabriel García, was a known womanizer and a conservative, a match that was fiercely and very publicly resisted by the staunchly liberal colonel.
The colonel saw it as a social, political, and moral affront.
He actively tried to separate them. He went so far as to send his daughter, Luisa Santiago Marquez, far away to another town. But Gabriel was persistent.
Relentless. He pursued her with dramatic violin serenades under her window. He wrote countless romantic, desperate letters, and he even used the new technology of the time, the telephone, to call her until the family finally capitulated.
That's a great story.
That incredible persistence, set against this backdrop of social resistance and family honor and political tension, is inherently dramatic. Gabo later adapted and recast this specific tragicomic story as the novel Love in the Time of Cholera.
Right. It provides that perfect blend of passionate, lifelong emotion set against all these external forces trying to pull the lovers apart.
And this gives us a fascinating insight into his artistic mind. He often said that the only difference between the novel and reality was that his parents actually married.
And he added that as soon as they married, they were no longer interesting as literary figures.
Which suggests that for him, the true literary interest was in the decades-long pursuit, the tension, the unresolved yearning that defined their courtship, not the peaceful domesticity that came after.
Exactly.
So despite this rich imaginative background, Gabo's formal path was initially steered by obligation. He started law school, first at the National University of Colombia, then at the University of Cartagena.
Mostly to please his father.
Right, primarily to satisfy his father's professional ambitions for him.
But the call of fiction was just too strong. He was deeply inspired early on by Franz Kafka's short story, The Metamorphosis. The narrative structure of a man suddenly waking up as a gigantic insect, and it's presented without explanation or comment, that resonated deeply with the young GGM. This was, in a sense, a European model of the inexplicable, a high art parallel to his grandmother's storytelling.
So he quit law school.
Entirely. In 1950, to focus solely on his real passion, professional writing. And he didn't start with novels. He started with the necessary grounding discipline of journalism.
He worked for El Universal in Cartagena, and then El Heraldo in Barranquilla, where he took on every assignment, including writing a sort of whimsical daily column under the pen name Septimus.
It was a struggle. He mentioned getting maybe 3 pesos for a piece, another 3 for an editorial, but that scarcity, it forced him to be precise, immediate, and resourceful.
And this isn't just an anecdote about being a struggling writer. That journalistic foundation was absolutely vital because it led him to the Barranquilla group.
Exactly. This informal association of writers and journalists was a cauldron of intellectual development. Through them, he was introduced to the literature of the wider world, including massive figures like Virginia Woolf and especially William Faulkner.
Faulkner's influence was huge, right?
Oh, massive. Faulkner's narrative techniques, his use of multiple perspectives, his focus on a single, isolated fictional space like Yoknapatawpha County, his deep engagement with the historical sins of his region, that deeply influenced GGM and so many other Latin American authors.
It's that hands-on experience in journalism, constantly chasing facts and deadlines and the truth of the moment, that gives the point its weight. It made him, according to one critic, the one who is closest to everyday reality among the great living authors.
The ability to describe the price of tomatoes and eggs accurately, and the ability to believe that a ghost might be haunting the kitchen, that's the true preparation for magic realism.
Right.
His journalism cemented the reality half of the equation, ensuring his flights of fantasy were always anchored in the mud and politics of the Colombian coast.
Speaking of that unique style, let's move into the core of the literary universe he created. Magic realism is pretty much synonymous with Gabriel García Márquez, even though he didn't invent the term.
No, but he certainly popularized it internationally, and I would argue perfected its execution.
So how do we define it?
Well, the fundamental concept, which he got from his grandmother, is the seamless integration of magical elements and events within otherwise ordinary realistic situations. It's critical to differentiate this from, say, traditional fantasy.
How so?
In fantasy, magic needs its own internal logic, a set of rules. Here, in magic realism, the magic just is. It exists without explanation, without justification, and without really changing the reaction of the characters.
The stylistic hallmark, which we keep coming back to because it's so definitive, is that the most frightful, the most unusual things are told with a deadpan expression. The narrator never offers a subjective judgment or a moment of surprise.
And the classic definitive example, the moment that seems to stand in for the entire style in 100 Years of Solitude, perfectly illustrates this. It's the character Remedios the Beauty.
Yes.
She's folding laundry in the backyard, and while she's doing this, she begins to physically and spiritually ascend into heaven, carried up by the wind until she just disappears.
And what's crucial is how it's presented. It's narrated with the exact same matter-of-fact tone as describing the texture of the sheets or the humidity in the air. The act of domesticity hanging laundry is simultaneous with divine ascension. The two are inseparable.
And this is more than just a trick. GGM often used this technique as a profound, if subtle, philosophical critique, especially when he was addressing European readers and critics.
He argued that European readers often saw only the magic and failed to see the reality behind it. Why did he feel that disconnect existed?
He attributed it to their highly developed rationalism. He argued that this European perspective insists that reality is strictly limited to mundane facts like the price of tomatoes and eggs. For GGM, that rationalism was actually a form of intellectual blindness.
So the magic was just as real as the price of eggs.
To him, yes. He argued that the political violence, the historical cycles of tragedy, and the deep, abiding presence of myth and superstition in Latin America were just as real as any economic statistic. To ignore the ghosts was to ignore the full reality of the continent.
So magic realism wasn't just a style. It was an epistemological statement saying, this is how we experience reality. And that experience, he argued, was fundamentally marked by one primary emotion: solitude.
The theme of solitude runs like a river through nearly every major work. It's the driving force behind the Buendia family's tragic cycle in solitude, and it's deeply explored in Love in the Time of Cholera, where it examines the distinct solitude of unrequited love, the solitude of being in love, and the solitude that comes with old age.
GGM always maintained that solitude was a universal problem, a problem everybody has. But he transformed this deeply personal feeling into a collective continental experience, especially in his powerful 1982 Nobel acceptance speech, The Solitude of Latin America.
That speech is essential reading for understanding his political vision. He used the concept of solitude to describe the historical isolation and misinterpretation Latin America had suffered on the world stage.
He argued that when foreign powers try to interpret the complex reality of Latin America through foreign patterns, through intellectual frameworks not native to the region, it results in a dangerous form of distance.
Right, he said it makes the region ever less free, ever more solitary.
Can you give us a concrete example of that intellectual blindness?
Sure, think about the wars and coups of the mid-20th century. A Western pattern might interpret that conflict purely as an ideological struggle between democracy and communism, imposing a Cold War binary.
Right, a simple black and white view.
But GGM argued that the reality often stemmed from deep-seated, centuries-old social inequalities, internal feuds between oligarchies, like his own colonel's fight between liberals and conservatives, and the profound effects of foreign economic interference, like the United Fruit Company.
So when foreign powers intervened, based on that simplified reading,
they invariably made the situation worse, isolating the people from self-determination and thus increasing their continental solitude.
it's a powerful idea, political misinterpretation as its own form of isolation. And the stage for so much of this reality is, of course, Macondo.
Macondo is not just a backdrop, it's a central motif. While it was largely inspired by his childhood home of Aracataca, GGM described Macondo as not so much a place as a state of mind.
And that designation freed him.
Completely. It allowed him to establish a setting where reality operated precisely as he wished, where miracles and massacres could coexist seamlessly.
And the arc of Macondo directly reflects the tumultuous history of the Colombian coast. We see this even in his earlier novella, Leaf Storm.
In that book, Macondo is depicted during the banana boom, this period of temporary, feverish prosperity brought by the big American fruit companies.
Which was then followed by a devastating depression when those companies just packed up and left.
Exactly. 100 Years of Solitude takes that concept and expands it mythically. It chronicles the town's full existence, from its pristine founding, through its rise, its decline, and its ultimate total erasure. It's a complete cyclical microcosm of Latin American history.
Let's touch on the origin of the name Macondo, because it's such a beautiful example of finding poetry in the mundane.
It's a classic Gabo anecdote. He said he first saw the word on a sign for banana plantation while on a train journey with his mother as a young man. He just liked its poetic resonance before he even knew what it meant.
And he later learned it was a local tree.
A tropical tree, yeah, one that resembles the ceiba. The idea that a random signpost could be transformed into the site of the greatest literary saga of the century perfectly encapsulates his ability to elevate everyday experience.
Underneath all that magic, though, we have to address the grim historical reality that Gabo constantly wrestled with. The Colombian civil conflict known as La Violencia.
This was a devastating, protracted, undeclared civil war. It officially ran from 1948 into the early 1960s, but the tensions and violence lasted much longer, costing hundreds of thousands of lives.
And it was rooted in the historic political rivalry between the conservative and liberal parties, the same feud that defined his grandfather's life.
Precisely.
So how did Gabo, as a writer dedicated to both truth and art, choose to address this massive ongoing trauma?
He addressed it, but often through atmosphere and consequence rather than, say, explicit battle scenes. In novellas like No One Writes to the Colonel and in Evil Hour, the characters are facing the direct fallout of this era. Pervasive censorship, secret killings, arbitrary curfews, and these unjust, inescapable situations. The fragmentation and distrust caused by La Violencia are the silent characters in those books.
It sounds like In Evil Hour particularly focuses on that social disintegration.
It does. It describes a village where these anonymous, slanderous leaflets suddenly start appearing, targeting individuals with dark secrets, which leads to violence. This fear of hidden knowledge and the breakdown of civil society is a direct metaphor for the terror and lack of trust that defined the political climate during La Violencia.
But the crucial point, as we mentioned earlier, is that he's a lifelong committed leftist and anti-imperialist, yet he resolutely refused to turn his work into propaganda.
Fiercely political, yes, but he held that the ultimate duty of the revolutionary writer was simply to write well, meaning he believed that if a novel was well-crafted, its inherent power to capture and penetrate reality would automatically expose political and social injustices more effectively than any overt, heavy-handed polemic. The art, if it's successful, carries the politics naturally.
Okay, let's turn to the specific works that transformed him from a respected journalist-novelist into a global literary monument. starting with the one that changed everything, 100 Years of Solitude.
Gabo had carried the idea for this novel, this massive cyclical history of his grandparents' house and the founding of Macondo, since he was 18.
18, wow.
But for decades, he couldn't find the right narrative voice. The story was too big, too mythical, and too personal to tell in a conventional way.
And then the legendary moment happened in 1966. He was driving his family from Mexico City to Acapulco when the answer hit him.
He described it as a total epiphany. The instant he realized the entire saga had to be told in his grandmother's deadpan, matter-of-fact tone treating the fantastic as mundane truth, the whole structure of the novel just snapped into place.
And he literally pulled the car over, told his family the vacation was canceled, and they went home immediately.
Yep. That commitment required immediate, total sacrifice. He sold his car, a Chevrolet Impala, which was the family's primary asset, just so they'd have money to live on. He then locked himself away and wrote every single day for 18 months straight.
And we have to acknowledge the incredible foundational support of his wife, Mercedes Barcha, during this time.
Oh, absolutely. She was the one who kept the household running, negotiating credit for food with the butcher and baker, even getting 9 months of rent on credit from their landlord, while Gabo wrote what she later famously called the first 3,000 pages. Her faith was absolute.
That dedication resulted in the novel chronicling the history of Macondo through 7 generations of the Buendia family, weaving political history, biblical allegory, and just sheer impossible magic.
And it was an immediate global success. The praise was hyperbolic, yet somehow warranted. It led directly to his Nobel Prize. We mentioned William Kennedy's comparison to the Book of Genesis, which, speaks to the mythological scope of the book. It felt like a foundational text for a new understanding of history.
But I always find Gabo's own perspective on the novel's reception so refreshing. He often downplayed the critical response, almost mocking the academic seriousness of it all.
He did. He famously said that most critics don't realize that a novel like 100 Years of Solitude is a bit of a joke, full of signals to close friends.
Right. And so, with some preordained right to pontificate, they take on the responsibility of decoding the book and risk making terrible fools of themselves.
That quote suggests the book is an elaborate inside joke, a code accessible primarily to those who share the lived experience of Latin America, the history, the political realities, and the natural acceptance of myth. The magic is just the language.
If you aren't familiar with the historical trauma, the political cycles, or the family dynamics of the region, you might miss the joke and focus only on the ascending woman, rather than the profound tragedy of a family cursed by its own pride and solitude.
Precisely.
Before Solitude, though, his early journalistic career gave rise to a masterpiece of nonfiction, a work so explosive it actually changed his life, the story of a shipwrecked sailor.
This was a pivotal moment. It started as a series of 14 articles for the Bogotá newspaper El Espectador. Gabo interviewed a sailor named Luis Alejandro Velasco, the sole survivor of a Colombian Navy destroyer that sank in the Caribbean.
And the official Navy line was that the shipwreck was caused by a violent storm. But Gabo's deep dive, his tireless interviewing, revealed something else.
A much more damaging truth. The sailor confided that the vessel had actually capsized because it was carrying a massive, badly stowed cargo of contraband goods, refrigerators, washing machines, tires, that broke loose in a rough sea. The storm was just the official cover story.
Wow. So the publication of those articles revealing massive corruption within the Colombian military and government was
explosive. It was pure investigative nonfiction that threatened the powerful.
a huge scandal.
Was an act of significant political agitation, even though Gabo had only followed his journalistic duty to the facts. The resulting controversy was so volatile that El Espectador decided the safest course of action for Gabo and for them was to send him out of the country.
So he was effectively sent into exile.
An accidental, self-imposed exile that shaped his later perspective on European rationalism.
Moving to his later novels, in 1975, he published Autumn of the Patriarch. This novel deals with a theme that obsessed many Latin American writers, the figure of the eternal dictator.
Gabo was inspired to write this after personally witnessing the fall and flight of Venezuelan dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez. He intended the novel to be a synthesis, a composite of all the tyrants of the continent.
The novel is known for its dizzying, non-chronological structure. Why did he choose such a chaotic approach to narrate the life of this seemingly eternal dictator known simply as the General?
The structure itself reinforces the theme. The novel loops and repeats. Time loses its linearity. This circular, non-chronological movement told through collective shifting perspectives, it mirrors the experience of living under endless tyranny, where the future feels impossible and the past is constantly being rewritten.
It's all about total control.
This total, terrifying control over reality leads to the ultimate debilitating isolation. Gabo himself called the novel a poem on the solitude of power. The absolute nature of the general's rule means he can't trust anyone, leaving him tragically alone in his decaying palace.
Next up is the novel that really shows his mastery of blending genres, Chronicle of a Death Foretold from 1981. This is often seen as a piece of literary detective work.
It certainly is. Critics rightly place it as a unique combination of journalism, magic realism, and the detective genre. It was inspired by a real-life honor killing that took place in Sucre, Colombia in 1951, where a childhood friend of Gabo's was the victim.
But Gabo emphasized that very little of the actual events remained other than the general framework. The structure is what makes it so innovative.
Absolutely. The novel unfolds in an inverted fashion. The reader knows the outcome: Santiago Nosar will be murdered from the very first sentence.
No mystery about the what.
None. The narrator then acts like a journalist detective, piecing together fragments of memory, interviews, and public gossip, uncovering the events backward. The suspense is not who did it, but the horrifying realization of why no one intervened, despite everyone knowing the murder was foretold.
It's a masterful exercise in tension that directly draws on his journalistic instincts. The relentless pursuit of fact and detail applied to a fictional event where the community's collective inaction is the real tragedy. And finally, we circle back to his parents' influence with love in the Time of Cholera, published in 1985. It's renowned as a non-traditional love story that embraces love in the golden years.
We know the young, persistent love affair between Fermina Daza and Florentino Ariza is a direct fictionalization of his parents' tenacious courtship. But the novel also drew inspiration from a second, more somber story, didn't it?
It did, and this second source gave the novel its mature, poignant tone. Gabo read a newspaper story about two Americans nearly 80 years old who had maintained a lifelong secretive affair, meeting every year in Acapulco.
And tragically, they were murdered by a boatman who intended to rob them. Their deaths brought this long-standing secret romance to light.
That's a stunning parallel to the novel's focus on clandestine longevity.
Indeed. Gabo noted he was fascinated by the idea of their commitment. Two people, both married to others, maintaining a secret romantic life that persisted across decades and immense distances. Love in the Time of Cholera combines his parents' youthful, over-the-top persistence with this later, mature, and ultimately tragic secret passion. It celebrates the enduring power of love across a lifetime.
Gabo was never just a literary figure. He was always a highly visible political activist and commentator.
His political identity was inseparable from his grandfather's influence. He was a committed, outspoken leftist and a firm anti-imperialist, views that placed him firmly on the side of many revolutionary and anti-U.S. movements across the continent.
This brings us to his most famous and most controversial relationship, his close friendship with Cuban President Fidel Castro.
A relationship that spanned decades and was often described as nuanced. Gabo himself characterized it as primarily an intellectual friendship, based largely on their shared passion for literature. Castro was a prodigious reader and, reportedly, a great conversationalist on literary subjects.
But it was more than just talking books. Gabo used this proximity for specific political purposes, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah.
He was known to act as an informal, back-channel intermediary between Castro and other foreign governments. He specifically used his influence to try and soften the roughest edges of the Cuban regime, particularly regarding political prisoners and cultural policies.
So he praised some things, but was critical of others.
Right. He praised the revolution's achievements in literacy and healthcare, but was also a silent critic of certain aspects of its governance and lack of freedom.
But those outspoken political views and his strong anti-imperialism carried real costs, particularly north of the border.
For many years, U.S. immigration authorities labeled him a subversive and refused to grant him U.S. visas, effectively banning him from entering the country.
And this ban was only finally lifted during the administration of President Bill Clinton.
The irony is just delicious, isn't it? Clinton was a major literary admirer of Gabo, famously citing 100 Years of Solitude as his favorite novel. The politician lifted the ban because the reader admired the author.
Gabo's international fame placed him at the very forefront of what became known as the Latin American boom.
Yes, a period in the 1960s and 70s where Latin American writers achieved massive global literary and commercial visibility. He was a leading figure alongside other absolute giants like Julio Cortázar, Carlos Fuentes, and Mario Vargas Llosa.
That association with Vargas Llosa, however, led to one of the most famous and physically intense feuds in modern literary history.
The infamous incident in Mexico City in 1976. Vargas Llosa, a Nobel laureate himself, walked up to Garcia Marquez in public and just punched him squarely in the face.
Lift him with a black eye.
Yep. The exact cause is still subject to endless literary speculation. Was it over a personal matter? A bitter political disagreement over Castro? Intense literary rivalry? We don't have definitive proof, but the dramatic physicality of it all underscored the volatile personalities and high stakes of that era.
Shifting to another creative passion, Gabo had a profound, lifelong relationship with cinema, which makes perfect sense given the sheer visual quality of his writing.
He often described the language of his imagination as fundamentally visual or graphic, noting that every single one of his stories originated from a single, initiating visual image that he had to capture and expand upon. His writing process was essentially a cinematic one.
And he wasn't just an admirer of film, he was an active participant.
He worked as a film critic, a dedicated screenwriter, and he was instrumental in co-founding and serving as executive director of the International Film and Television School in Havana. His early novella, Arandira, was actually written initially as a screenplay.
Which just shows how fluid those boundaries were for him. And his novels, naturally, translated well to the screen.
Right. In major adaptations like the 1987 film of Chronicle of a Death Foretold and the large-scale 2007 production of Love in the Time of Cholera. They tried, with varying success, to translate the internal magic of the page into external action.
In his later life, health issues prompted a significant refocusing of his energies. In 1999, he received a terrifying diagnosis.
He was initially misdiagnosed with pneumonia, but later learned he was suffering from lymphatic cancer. Although chemotherapy was successful, the near-death experience prompted a dramatic change. He said he reduced contact with friends, disconnected his telephone, and locked myself in to write every day without interruption.
This intense focus led directly to his massive 3-volume memoir project, starting with Living to Tell the Tale in 2002. It was his way of consolidating his own history.
Sadly, the last years of his life were marked by decline. In 2012, his brother confirmed publicly that Gabo was suffering from dementia. He died of pneumonia at age 87 on April 17, 2014, in Mexico City.
The outpouring of grief was immediate and continental. Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos called him the greatest Colombian who ever lived. His family decided to deposit his extensive papers and personal effects at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin, ensuring researchers could access his legacy.
But the very final chapter of his published life came posthumously and is, well, it's fraught with complication. Despite his later struggles with memory, he had been working on a final novel called En Agosto Nos Vemos, or Until August.
And this final novel was published recently on March 6, 2024, which would have been his 97th birthday. But here's the massive caveat. The book was published against his reported explicit instruction that the manuscript be destroyed upon his death.
A huge complication.
So if we look back over this journey, we see the profound, complex genius of Gabriel García Márquez, a man molded by two contradictory figures, the pragmatic, historical colonel and the accepting, supernatural grandmother.
And that singular upbringing was the template that allowed him to forge magic realism, a style that perfectly captures the profound tragedy, myth, and political instability of Latin America. He successfully addressed the universal solitude of humankind and the geopolitical solitude of an entire continent.
He transformed the painful, specific history of Colombia, the civil wars, the banana massacres, the relentless cycle of violence, into the epic, mythical saga of Macondo, creating work so powerful that it gave new language and life to Latin American literature and challenged the very nature of Western reality.
He leaves behind a legacy defined by tireless creative dedication, a life spent balancing two careers, fiction and journalism, and a profound insistence that art, when done well, is the most powerful political statement one can make.
So what does this all mean for us, the readers and listeners today? Here's the final thought for you to carry away from this deep dive. Gabriel García Márquez, a writer who spent his entire career exploring the profound isolation of individuals and nations, reportedly requested that his final creative act, his last manuscript, Until August, be destroyed upon his death. His sons justified publishing it by saying the novel was too good to remain unread. Given that Gabo spent a lifetime fighting to control the narrative of his own reality and his continents, What does it truly mean when the final artistic decision, the definitive act of silence and solitude he commanded for his last story, is ultimately denied by the very people he trusted to guard his legacy? Was the desire to destroy the manuscript the ultimate final statement on the solitude of the author? We leave you with that question.